All right, everybody, thank you very much for coming. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Bill Schreck-Geisen. I'm the chair of the Political Science Department. In a moment, I'll introduce our speaker, excuse me, Dr. Karen Sebold. I wanted to thank all of you for coming. I'd also like to thank the university's provost, Dr. Indrajit Chowdhury, for providing the department with the resources to put this event on. I also give special thanks to political science staffer Patrick Grimes for helping getting all of this set up and for getting the cookies ordered. As you all should know by now, we have refreshments outside. They're available for after the talk, or if you want to grab one right now, that's fine. There are lots of cookies. Be sure to get some. We are here because in the year 2005, then U.S. Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia was so concerned about Americans' deplorable lack of knowledge about the U.S. Constitution that he slipped a rider into an omnibus budget bill mandating every September 17th be Constitution Day and stipulating that all institutions receiving federal aid, such as K through 12 schools and universities like ours, receive federal money, use the day to talk about the U.S. Constitution. I would argue we talk about the U.S. Constitution every day in the political science department, so we don't need a special day for that. But Senator Byrd's mandate gives us an opportunity every year to talk about some special things that we find interesting related to the United States Constitution, including the things that Dr. Sebold will talk about in a minute. Before she gets to her talk, let's introduce her. Dr. Karen Sebold is an assistant professor of political science and the director of legal studies in our department. She received her undergraduate degree in political science from Rogers State University in 2005, her MA in political science at the University of Arkansas in 2008. In 2013, she received her Ph.D. from the Politique Ph.D. program, also here at the University of Arkansas. Professor Sebold is a past finalist for the university's John Emhoff Award, a Fulbright College Summer Research Fellow, a Fulbright College Connor Fellow, and the winner of the 2025 Department of Political Science Award for Outstanding Teaching. Among her several publications, she is the author of 3 books, including a recently published book, Evaluating Campaign Finance Oversight, an assessment of the Federal Elections Commission. Indeed, she is one of the nation's leading experts on campaign finance and has written extensively on the policies related to how our country's laws are enforced as they relate to funding political campaigns and the agency responsible for enforcing those laws, the FEC. Dr. Sebold's talk is titled Legalizing Corporate Political Speech, How Citizens United Laid the Groundwork for Corporations' Right to Free Speech. She will talk about political donations, free speech, and the relationship to free and fair elections. We will follow her talk with a brief Q&A session. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Karen Sebold.
Thanks, Dr. Schreck-Geisen. That was really nice when you put it all together like that, so I appreciate you kind of informing the audience of who I am. Hopefully you can hear me. I'm going to turn this up a little bit. I know many of you know me from my classroom. You're currently in my class or you've had a class with me. So you know I'm really excited to talk about campaign spending and fundraising. And I'll talk about it from the aspect of kind of the First Amendment, which has allowed for a lot of corporate spending in elections. So I'll talk about what kind of led to that, and I'll kind of get into some of the issues that might lead to as a result of some of the court cases that allow for corporations to spend money like individuals during an election. Now, all of this spending is really important to talk about because it has such an impact on the outcomes of the elections, the folks that get elected, as well as the issues that they're going to support or oppose once they're elected. So that's kind of my angle with the First Amendment and the Constitution. I am excited to talk about the Constitution. We are celebrating 236 years of the U.S. Constitution. As of today, it is the celebration of that since it went into effect. I love talking about the Constitution, like most other political scientists, because it is the basis for American democracy, and really was one of the country's oldest constitutions, or the world's oldest constitutions, not just the country. Technically, it's our second constitution, too. We had Articles of Confederation before that that went into effect and lasted for about 10 years. So I like to talk about the history of the Constitution, and I really like to get into it in relation to the First Amendment. So yeah, I kind of tightened up my title a little bit, but I will talk to you about Citizens United. I'll talk to you about the things that led up to Citizens United, as well as the court cases and FEC decisions that come after that really allow for all of this corporate spending. So first off, we have to talk about political speech and democracy before we talk about corporations and political spending. Political speech has made possible the rights of labor, women, children, minorities, and so on. The right for individual citizens to speak out about politics and government is the cornerstone of American democracy, and it is imperative that this political right not be infringed upon by the government. But does this right also belong to corporations? That's kind of the question I will explore today, and I will explain to you how the Supreme Court answers this question. So the Supreme Court is essentially going to say, yes, this right does belong to corporations as long as they remain independent of the electoral candidates and parties. They don't contribute directly to a candidate, or they were not allowed to previously, and they can't at this time. Maybe at some point they'll be able to. Nor can they coordinate with the candidates. So that's kind of an important distinction about corporate spending versus individual spending or PAC spending. This is essentially the basis of the Citizens United decision, and it lays the groundwork for further deregulation of the campaign finance system. So I spent a lot of my time looking at the loosening of the campaign finance laws and what are the results of that. So yeah, as long as they're independent, they're going to be allowed to do so, and as long as they don't contribute directly, they'll be allowed to do so. So this is going to be a controversial decision. This is not something that's going to go over very easily with lots of groups out there, public watchdog groups, and people that are concerned about the wealthy and large corporations having influence over the process. So, because this is going to lead to the rise of corporate election spending. Corporate-funded outside groups have become a dominant force in American politics as a result of this decision, and that's where a lot of the concern is coming from. This is largely a result, again, of the Citizens United decision. Again, this was very controversial. In fact, during President Obama's State of the Union address shortly after the court decision, he will be rebuked by Samuel Alito in the audience, a Supreme Court justice. I'll show you a clip of this. I will attempt to show you a clip of this. Watch this clip. It'll take me a second, but we will watch this. This is an important clip because it really gets into the controversy between the two kind of ideologies on the topic. And it was really rare for somebody to speak out against the president like this manner. If I can get to the clip. I should have had these loaded, I apologize. So this one and one other to show you, if it allows.
With all due deference to separation of powers, last week the Supreme Court reversed a century of law that I believe will open the floodgates for special interests, including foreign corporations, to spend without limit in our elections. I don't think American elections should be bankrolled by America's most powerful interests, or worse, by foreign enemies. They should be decided by the American people. And I urge Democrats and Republicans to pass a bill that helps correct it.
Okay, so, generally these Supreme Court justices are very stoic and very respectful of the president when he is giving his State of the Union address or any other types of speeches, but they were shaking their head. They were like, we don't like what you're saying, President Obama. You are speaking negatively about our decision, and they believe disingenuinely about their decision. Of course, since then, we know that this decision did lead to tons of corporate spending. So he wasn't necessarily wrong on that, but there were divisions on how they looked at this issue. And the conservatives on the Supreme Court had one view of corporate spending, and President Obama and the liberals had a different view. So they were totally at odds. Now, this seems really minor compared to today's political situation, but this was a big deal back then. And shortly after, we will start to see all this spending, and it starts to kind of point to some of the issues that people are concerned about related to corporations being involved in elections. Now, these corporations and wealthy donors who are now allowed to spend all of this money, they don't always get the results they want in an election. Money does not always lead to a certain outcome. There are many instances where candidates or campaigns have spent the most money, but they did not win the election. And we can kind of point to different examples in history of when that might have occurred. But this money certainly supports or opposes those candidates, and at times can have a major impact. They don't always get the impact they want or the outcome, but they often do. And so it's controversial. And if we kind of look at the money that's been spent since 2010 by outside groups, it's grown significantly. There's tons of outside spending, and a large part of it is done by super PACs, which will grow out of this decision, and a lot of it is done by other types of groups. But combined, we're looking at over $2.6 billion spent in the 2020 election cycle, and it's pretty close to that in the 2024 cycle too. And if you look at before 2010, it's very minimal. So yeah, there was a lot of spending there was some spending by these groups before 2010, but it grows significantly after 2010. And so regardless of if you think it's okay for them to do that or not, it's definitely had an effect. But, it wasn't always this way. Before Citizens United, corporations were allowed to be active in political campaigns or elections, but they had to do this through what we call political action committees, PACs. So corporations could do this, but they had to have certain restrictions and regulations on how they did this through these very regulated PACs. They had to keep separate, segregated accounts to collect voluntary donations, and only from people connected to their company. So you couldn't force someone to donate to the corporate PAC, and you had to only solicit those donations from people, again, inside the company, not outside of the company. So if, say, GE had a corporate funded PAC, it was funded by people who volunteered to give that money and by people who worked for GE. Also, only non-connected PACs could solicit donations from the public. So PACs that wanted to spend money on elections had to be non-connected, meaning they couldn't coordinate or direct money specifically to a candidate or a party. Again, that's what the word non-connected means. Like, in other words, you're totally independent of parties and candidates. They were banned from using their funds as well from their treasury. So you couldn't use treasury funds to fund the PAC or election activities. So we had clear lines and divisions between what these corporate funded PACs could do and what they could not do. These rules were established in the Federal Election Act in the 1970s. There was a big federal election act that comes in and really starts to standardize how campaign finance is going to look, how much people could give, how much could be spent, things like that. And then the rules are going to continue and be added to in 2002 with the McCain-Feingold Act, also known as the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act. They're going to say that, hey, these corporate funded PACs, they can't spend money on advertisements that are aired 30 days before a primary or 60 days before a general election. So these corporate funded groups existed, but as I showed you in the graph before, they were very limited in terms of the amount of money they could spend, mostly because they were so restricted. So this wasn't a big thing for these groups before 2010. But once Citizens United happens, as well as a few other court decisions and FEC opinions, they really start to take advantage of these laws. They get sophisticated about how to use them, and as you can see, the spending grows pretty exponentially. They were also banned from engaging in express advocacy, which is the idea that if they air an advertisement, it cannot mention direct support or opposition for a candidate. You could talk about the issues and the ideas, but you couldn't be trying to run this ad to get people to support or oppose. And there were a list of different types of words that could not be mentioned in an ad unless you wanted it to be classified as express advocacy. including support or oppose, vote for, vote against, that type of language. So any of that kind of language, if it's used in the ad, that would be considered express advocacy, and your corporate funded PAC couldn't do that. And so that kind of kept down a lot of the ads and a lot of the negative ads as well, and certainly the spending. But then we get a change in the Supreme Court shortly after this case. Sarah Day O'Connor is going to retire, and she will be replaced by Samuel Alito. And Samuel Alito is going to be a much more conservative judge, especially on the issue of campaign finance. And they're going to hear this case, the FEC versus Wisconsin Right to Life in 2007, and they're going to start to kind of build a loophole for these corporate-funded PACs. They're essentially going to decide that yes, you can ban corporate-funded electioneering communications. Don't get too caught up on that word, electioneering communications. It just means political ads. You can ban corporate-funded ads for express advocacy, but only if the sole purpose is to express support for or against a candidate. So they kind of come in and they build a loophole. So they're basically saying only if this ad is super focused on supporting or opposing, can you ban that? They come in and say, hey, like, you know, Barack Obama supports health care for all. That's going to cost America a lot of money. We're worried about the debt and the deficit that might arise from that. Therefore, please consider that when you go to the polls. That might be something that would fall into a loophole and be able to get around that expressed advocacy, because you're more focused on the issue of health care than defeating Barack Obama. So, hey, they say that here's a little loophole, a little nugget we'll throw those corporate-funded groups. They will say but you can stop them from airing issue ads in the months preceding an election. So they're kind of coming in and still reinforcing, but you cannot stop them from airing an issue ads. They're kind of coming in and reinforcing the idea that, you know, corporations can be involved in issue activity, issue ads. Corporations are affected by these issues. They're going to be the ones that are largely going to be regulated quite often with the issues that these elected officials deal with. So in their minds, they're going to say, hey, you know, we're going to let you continue to restrict them, but there are some exceptions. This essentially overturns the McCain-Feingold Act of 2002, which is trying to stop those corporations from airing those ads right before the election. And it's really controversial. People are going to be upset by this ruling. They're going to say this is just a continuation of things to come, or something, you know, that this loophole is going to set up the groundwork for more things to come related to corporate spending. Okay, then we get the Citizens United Political Victory Fund. The origins of this will lead to the Citizens United case. But it begins in 2004. This is a political advocacy group. It leans toward the conservative ideology. And they've been active since about 1988 in various issues related to politics, but largely trying to get conservative candidates elected. They start to fund a PAC, or an outside group, to engage in election activities. In 2004, this group, they attempted to block Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11 from being aired in the theaters. A lot of you were probably not born before 2004, or maybe right around that time, so maybe you're not familiar with Fahrenheit 9/11, but it was a controversial documentary questioning what led to 9/11 and the response by the Bush administration. It was kind of a controversial document. It was definitely kind of coming in with a liberal ideological viewpoint. So this group says, hey, we want to ban that from airing. And the courts, the complaint goes to the FEC, and the FEC decides that that documentary can air in the theaters. They're going to say it kind of meets the media exemption ban on outside groups. They're going to say this is media, so it's allowed to air in theaters. Well, that group is not happy with that, and in 2004, they seek an advisory opinion with the FEC to see if they could also qualify for the media exemption to air their anti-John Kerry film. So again, John Kerry, he is the candidate for the Democratic Party that's opposing President Bush, the Republican candidate in 2004. So this group kind of puts together a documentary, very kind of anti-John Kerry, takes a conservative viewpoint, and they want to air it too. Hey, if Michael Moore can do this with Fahrenheit 9/11, why can't we air this too? And so the FEC is going to say, no, you can't air that. That doesn't meet the media exemption. So then they're pretty upset about that, but they're going to like, okay, well, we're going to take this challenge or this test further. They're going to create Hillary the movie. This will be kind of a big deal for them in 2000. This is going to be a 2007, when they make this movie. She is running for the Democratic nomination in 2008 in the primary. She will not win that nomination, as you most likely know. Barack Obama will. But this group is kind of thinking she's going to win, as most people were in the political world. She was kind of the front runner for the 2008 nomination. And so most people had all their eyes on Hillary Clinton, not Barack Obama, because he was a relative. Let me just put that on pause. He was a relative startup. Not a lot of folks knew about Barack Obama, but everyone knew about Hillary Clinton. Her husband had been president. So they put together this movie, and they're going to take their challenge back to the FEC and the courts. Here's a little documentary about this movie. I want you to just view it, and then we'll talk about, do you think this is an issue ad or more around the idea of express advocacy?
Is claiming basically the entire 8 years of the Clinton presidency as wrong, except for the stuff that didn't work out, in which case she says she has nothing to do with it.
She makes herself sound like she has diplomatic experience, like she has managerial experience, as if she has policy development experience. She doesn't have any of those things. She does not answer questions straight out.
I did not say that it should be done.
You said yes.
No.
You thought it made sense to do it.
No, I didn't, Chris, but the point is, what are we going to do with all these illegal immigrants?
Unless I missed something, Senator Clinton said two different things in the course of about 2 minutes.
She's driven by the power. She's driven to get the power. That is the driving force in her life.
She is steeped in controversy, steeped in sleaze. That's why they don't want us to look at her record.
Well, I think it's worth remembering, after her healthcare fiasco, the Clinton team put it aside.
I mean, certainly you have to ask whether she's learned a lot from that experience. It was a failure. She knows it was a failure. It was a very embarrassing failure for her.
She's a person who's struggling herself with figuring out who she is, or more importantly, how she wants to present herself to the American public.
She's deceitful. She'll make up any story, lie about anything, as long as it serves her purpose at the moment. And the American people are going to catch on to it.
I can't think of any other politician in history who has shown such a disrespect and a contempt for the Constitution and the rule of law as Hillary. And I represented Richard Nixon's best friend, and I knew Richard Nixon. And I'll tell you something, she's no Richard Nixon, she's worse.
Ruthless, vindictive,
Venal, sneaky,
ideological, intolerant.
liar is a good one.
Scares the hell out of me.
I am sick and tired of people who say that if you debate and you disagree with an administration, somehow you're not patriotic, and we should stand up and say, we are Americans and we have a right to debate and disagree with any administration.
Okay, so issue ad or express advocacy? I'll let you decide, but that felt like express advocacy to me more than an issue because there was no specific issue mentioned. So yeah, when they're gonna try to air this ad, and they're going to complain to the FEC that, hey, you're not letting us air this ad. Your restrictions are not allowing us to because you're saying this is express advocacy. So in 2007, they sued the FEC in the DC District Court because they believed that this agency and the restrictions that were in place were just stopping them from airing their ad, yet Michael Moore was able to air his movie in theaters. Also, this movie that they're trying to air, they're not trying to air it in theaters, they're actually doing it on pay-per-view, which again, you guys might be too young to remember pay-per-view, or direct viewing. But you used to be able to do that when you were at home. You had all these movies and channels or documentaries that you could order directly on your TV, kind of like streaming. It was the origins of streaming. And so they're saying, hey, we're not forcing you to watch this. You would have to go online and find it and pay to watch it. So it's not like we're forcing you to watch it like you would a political advertisement aired on a national television station. But the FEC says, no, we're not going to let you. We're not going to let you do that. They have to sue them. The DC District Court also says, no, we're not going to let you do that. You're going to lose this appeal. So they're going to have to take their case all the way to the Supreme Court, which generally takes a little bit of time. It only took them a few years to get to the Supreme Court. Of course, it was in 2010. It's going to be well after the 2008 election. So what their intention was with this film really doesn't matter since the election is long after. They don't have that right to air that film during the election. It's going to take the courts years to hear their decision. Now, they're thankful that, she was not nominated the candidate, so they didn't have the fears play out about Hillary like they expected. But they're like, hey, we're still going to continue to challenge this law because we think what has happened to us is an infringement on our First Amendment rights, especially, again, when you let Michael Moore run his film in theaters. So this leads to the Citizens United versus FEC 2010 case. It's very controversial. I have heard so much stuff about the Citizens United case. Much of it is inaccurate and is not completely true. Also, I've heard a lot in terms of the fears and worries of what would happen after Citizens United, and some of those things played out and some of those things have not. But I do know one thing is that a lot of people associate this case with the idea of corruption in politics. And, if you take my money in politics class, which I'll push to you after this lecture, we'll unpack that. We'll talk about that because corruption's a really big word and it can mean a lot of different things. But I don't know that I would necessarily say this is corruption. We'll talk about that shortly. What will happen, though, is when this case goes to the Supreme Court, they're going to consider a couple initial questions. The first one, which I asked you already, is this movie or documentary, they call it Hillary the movie, but it's really a documentary. Is it express advocacy or issue advocacy? Is it focused on trying to support or oppose a candidate? Again, that's express advocacy. Or is it focused on the issues? I heard one issue mentioned healthcare, but I didn't hear other issues or much about healthcare mentioned. So is it is it that? Is it issue advocacy? Also, again, they bring it up the on-demand format that you would have to get to get this film. Was the on-demand format subject to the same restrictions that the other things like Fahrenheit 9/11 had been subject to? They're gonna consider these questions. And then they're also going to call back the parties into the case, and they're going to narrow the questions. So these are kind of the questions at the beginning of the court case. They'll call the parties back into the room, and they'll say, hey, we want to actually consider a broader question. Can corporations spend freely in elections if they don't give directly to candidates? We're thinking those two questions are okay, but this is kind of the more important question. But this is also the question that's really going to set up this idea that corporations will be allowed to spend. The court will focus on that broad question and decide that corporate funding of independent political broadcast in a candidate's election cannot be limited because doing so would violate the First Amendment. So they're basically going to now create this kind of law that allows corporations to spend. It's also basically going to give corporations the same First Amendment rights as citizens have to political speech. So they're going to decide on this broad question that they can do that. The problem is that the laws really restrict individuals and how much they can give and how much they can spend or what they give to candidates. And so we have restrictions on us under the First Amendment, but now these corporations, they're going to be kind of given unlimited freedom to spend freely, unlimited spending, as long as they don't do it directly. So in some respects, the corporations have more rights and freedom to political spending than individuals do or political parties. And often these corporations are representing a few people compared to, say, the individual citizens of the country or political parties. Political parties represent lots of people, Republicans and the Democratic Party. And so they're actually kind of continuing to restrict parties, continuing to restrict individuals, but allowing corporations to have more freedom to spending. And as a political scientist, that's where my concern is that they are less limited than us. And a lot of that is based on the Buckley v. Vallejo case of 1976, which sets up the idea that direct giving needs to be limited. Giving directly to a candidate can lead to quid pro quo, which is a form of corruption, like I was just mentioning, corruption and political spending. We tend to think of those two concepts going hand in hand. And the courts help us think about that because of their ruling in 76, where they say, yeah, that's why we gotta limit the individual donor, the giver of the money. They could be corrupt when they're giving this money. They could have corrupt reasons for giving this money. But then corporations, as long as they don't get to give directly, they're allowed to spend freely. So the idea of quid pro quo hasn't really been put onto the corporations like it has been the individuals. And that's my concern, is that individuals aren't treated as well as the corporations. Okay, well, that's the one case that kind of leads to outside groups now being able to spend a little more freely. Then we get the Speech Now versus FEC case. This is going to be a case that goes through the DC District Court just 6 days after Citizens United. And it's going to deal with a PAC, a political action committee, who is saying, hey, if these outside groups can spend freely, why can't we spend freely? So a PAC advocating for free speech will sue for the right to also raise unlimited donations for the purpose of express advocacy. So now PACs are saying, hey, if outside groups can do this, why can't we? But PACs, remember, they're connected. They typically give directly to the candidates. They typically spend money related to supporting or opposing candidates. They coordinate with the candidates. But now they're saying, hey, we want to act like those outside groups. So they're going to ask, are contribution limits on standard PACs, are those still constitutional? And are donor reporting requirements on PACs still constitutional? So the DC District Court will take this case, and then we'll basically decide that, yeah, the contribution limits are probably not legal, so we're going to overturn those, but we're going to uphold the reporting requirements. And that's always been kind of a big cornerstone in campaign finance, is the reporting requirements. The other had been the limits on individuals and groups. But now they're overturning that kind of what we call cornerstone of American democracy. They're saying, yeah, you guys can raise unlimited money, but you still have to report where you're getting that money from. So they're upholding some of the laws that were applied to these groups, but they're getting rid of some of them, kind of opening up a loophole for them. So then this actually kind of leads to the birth of the super PAC. It actually occurs when we get an FEC advisory opinion. The FEC is the kind of watchdog group in the federal government that oversees all this campaign finance spending, the Federal Election Commission. That is their primary task. But they also issue advisory opinions, especially after big court decisions, that kind of educate and instruct the donors and the groups about what they can and can't do after this big ruling. So they'll come in after this Speech Now ruling and basically just kind of solidify or codify the idea that allowing corporations to form these IE-only groups. So they're saying, yeah, corporations are allowed to raise and spend all this money, but again, they have to keep it independent, and they should do it through an independent spending group, an IE group, an independent expenditure group. So super PACs are now going to start to form these IE groups. This is kind of where we get the term super PAC, because these groups will now raise unlimited amounts of money from anyone and spend freely on express advocacy. So a lot of people think we get the term super PAC from the Citizens United case, but it's really the combination of Citizens United, Speech Now, and this FEC advisory opinion. So you can't just blame the Supreme Court. There's the District Court, and then there's this federal agency that's involved, and that's opening up and loosening the laws for corporate groups. So then we we get one more court case that I'll talk about, and it comes in the form of Carey v. FEC in 2011. And this is where PACs are now going to say, hey, we too want to operate like a corporate funded IE group. So this is kind of like the last court case that kind of comes in and really opens this up for outside groups. So this too will be in the DC District Court. It will be a case that allows those traditional PACs to begin on raising unlimited funds and operate like an IE group as long as they maintain a separate bank account. Sorry for the typo in that line. IE groups. So now PACs too can be IE groups. That's really going to make them what we might call hybrid PACs or super duper PACs. So PACs are now operating like IE groups, which were before funded by corporations. And you can't blame them for trying to do this because it's rational for them to do so. If one group can do something, why can't we? We're all trying to have influence on the election, and they're going to say we should be able to have just as much influence as those corporate funded IE groups. And so that's basically what's going to happen. Shortly after this, the FEC will also get involved and issue another advisory opinion. And they will basically allow these groups to keep their donors private if they open up a 501c group. So now these PACs, they're going to have these IE-only groups. Before, they had to report who their donors were, kind of the cornerstone of American democracy, transparency, sunlight on who the donors and givers are of all this money. And now that is gone too. And that is where we get the term dark money. Dark money groups, these 501c groups. This is kind of like the thing you want if you're trying to influence elections. There's a lot of reasons why you would want to do this. If you donate to a 501c group, your donation can be a write-off on your taxes. And for those people over 21, like 3 or 4 of us in here, we can appreciate that. When you do your taxes, you're trying to get as many write-offs as you can, so your tax bill is almost zero, or maybe even less, so you get something back. That's fantastic. So if you want to do that, consider giving to a 501c group. Another thing about these 501c groups is, again, they're keeping their donors private. There's a lot of reasons why that might be a good thing. This might be, if you are wanting to give money into the political system and you want to influence an election or maybe an issue that's going to come up after the election, what better way to give than to give to one of these 501c groups because they're keeping their donor list private. And that means you would not have to fear any kind of retribution for contributing to a political group. And these days we have to worry about that. Back in the day when this was all happening, few people cared about that as much. But, occasionally a few of us would get online and look up who's giving to who. That would actually be an exercise I would do in my money and politics class. I'd be like, hey guys, I'm going to show you the FEC website. Let's look up who our professors give their money to. That's kind of fun. I love to look up Bill Schreckheis because he was one of my professors. He didn't give any money though. But not enough to register. You have to give like $200 or more for it to register during an election cycle to a candidate or party. Now, if you give less than 200 to different candidates, different parties, that won't pop up. But once you hit that $200 mark for any particular candidate, then they have to report you to the FEC. So it's kind of fun to go in there and look people up and who they give money to. With these 501c groups, that's not possible because they don't report. So there are going to be many people that advocate for that being a good thing so that you don't face political retribution for giving to the candidate or party that you support. And it doesn't matter if that's on the left or the right. You can imagine working in an academic institution. It may not be as possible, there may not be a few people around here that wouldn't like me supporting a Republican candidate. And if they look that up and see I did that, there could be retribution for that. Not that that would ever happen in my department or this college because it's so wonderful. I'm going to say that as my chair sits right here. But that is a perfect example of why maybe you don't want that to be reported. And maybe that's why you would support these 501c groups not having to report their donors. So, there is possibly reasons why this might not be a bad thing, and this might also be constitutional. The Constitution also has a 9th Amendment, which is kind of your right to privacy amendment. And that has always been applied to all kinds of things related to bodily autonomy and other things, but why not political speech? Shouldn't I have the right to keep my dollars that support a political idea private? And then the other side of the aisle is that, well, maybe that should be reported because we want to know who's supporting what ideas and what candidates. My concern would be less with the individuals and more with the corporations that are funding the candidates. But that's kind of where we're at in our campaign finance system right now. They say that we can keep these donors private if they're giving to these specific 501c groups. Now, a lot of corporations will go out and open these 501c groups, or they will be funding these super PACs, these 501c groups. So they're going to be given a lot of leeway. They're probably about the best vehicle for giving in the political system, especially if you're concerned, again, about retribution for your dollars, if you want to keep it private who you're giving your money to. And these days, again, there are reasons why you might want to do that. So we get all of this dark money, and this is kind of how it typically flows through the system. Donors will give to a 501c4. Again, there's lots of reasons why you might. Maybe you want to keep your donations private, you like the idea of getting a write-off, or you're just really connected to one of these groups for one reason or another. They're going to give that money to super PACs who are then going to spend it on all of these ads. And quite often, most of these ads do tend to be on the negative side. That's one of the other complaints about all of this dark money spending, is that it funds all of this negative advertising, which is leading to all of this negative partisanship and polarization. Most of these negative ads aren't about supporting one candidate and trying to convince you that you should support them for various reasons. They're usually focused on opposing candidates. Most of the money that is spent by these groups is going to be very negative and oppositional. Again, that's what we'll do in my money and politics class. I'll show you how to collect all of this data, and we'll look at the money that supports candidates versus oppose. We'll look at all sides of the aisle, we'll make great comparisons, and you'll see, yeah, most of it is oppositional, and especially over the last 10 years. And it does really correlate with the rise in negative partisanship and polarization. So if you want to solve polarization, if you want to get past all this negative partisanship, we might have to look to the campaign finance system. We might have to make some reforms to it so that some groups and corporations don't have more rights than individual citizens, regardless of what side of the political aisle you're on. And if you look at all the money that's spent by dark money groups, direct spending versus contributions reported to the FEC. This isn't the best graphic, but the dark part of the bar is direct spending that is reported to the FEC, spending that's directly given to candidates or parties or PACs, versus the spending that's given to super PACs, and then how much of that is dark. So it's definitely growing after 2010. By 2020, that seems to be the election cycle that just really triggers all of this outside spending, all of this dark money. Up until 2020, it was relatively low. If you look at 2010 and the couple cycles after that, it's 2014, 2016, relatively low. By 2020 though, it really takes off. So again, the polarizing system, it seems like this negative dark money spending is really kind of correlating with that. So we do have some lingering questions about all of this spending. Thousands of groups are now spending. By the time we get to 2015, 2020, we look at the number of groups and they've quadrupled. We look at the amount of money being spent by them and it's quadrupling. And it does lead to some lingering questions and concerns. Will elections be hijacked by people with the deepest pockets? Will this money continue to affect the outcome of elections? Will this money eclipse the influence of average citizens or political parties? And does it even matter? Some would say it doesn't matter who funds the message is still the same. It doesn't matter who funds the pro-abortion or the anti-abortion ad, the message is still the same. So, all of this money doesn't always lead to the outcome you want, so does it really matter if they spend all of this money? If they only win their elections some of the time? If they only get the result they want some of the time? So these are the types of questions I think about as I look at spending and money. Super PACs closely aligned with major candidates aren't new, they've been around for a long time. But by 2024, they did start to act a little bit differently. Campaigns started to rely more on the mega donor-backed independent groups for their core campaign activities, which had not been allowed before. But it was made possible because the FEC once again comes in and kind of starts to loosen the laws, and they start to allow significant cooperation between campaigns and super PACs. They basically eliminate most of the restrictions on campaigns' abilities to outsource core voter outreach to these groups. So these groups can now kind of start to coordinate some activities with the political candidates, and that's when we really start to see the money and spending take off in 2024. These changes also set the stage for someone like Elon Musk to come in and play a central role in the election. Lots of people, especially my students, have questions about that. Regardless of what side of the political aisle they're on, they're interested in why that's allowed to occur. He gave at least $277 million to 2 super PACs that supported Trump and other Republicans, and effectively became part of the Trump campaign. He was featured center stage at rallies. He funded another super PAC who donated another $240 million to fund direct mailing, canvassing, and spokesperson consultants in swing states for Trump. Musk was far from Trump's only billionaire backer. Others included venture capitalist David Sachs, who hosted a fundraiser in Silicon Valley where the cheapest ticket was $50,000. And if you were willing to spend $300, that $300,000, not $300, that bought you an intimate dinner with Donald Trump. Casino owner Miriam Allison also spent another $100 million for her pro-Trump super PAC. Richard Uihlein spent another $49 million in last year's third quarter of the race to support a pro-Trump super PAC. Many other big tech billionaires spent millions or billions supporting Trump. And of course, Harris had her billionaire backers as well. She had many notables: Dustin Moskowitz, Reed Hastings, Ben Horowitz, Bill Gates. Mega donors spent millions of what would be considered outside money, millions spent in states that they didn't have a tie with, like Arizona, Pennsylvania, and Ohio. So yeah, all of this activity on both sides of the aisle is really leading to a lot of concern. Certainly these laws and these FEC decisions have loosened any resemblance of the campaign finance system we had in the 1970s, which was created shortly after Watergate and the events that led to Watergate, which was a lot of mismanagement of campaign finance funds that funded that activity and led to all of this distrust of the American government. That's why Congress comes in the 70s and starts to pass these laws to try to restrict spending, restrict giving, try to reduce the appearance of quid pro quo or corruption. These laws have essentially overturned that. I would also say that, Congress has done nothing to respond. So it's not just the courts. Congress could step in and potentially pass reforms. But there doesn't seem to be any political will for that because campaign finance doesn't register as an important issue for the American public. Now, people will say they are concerned about corruption and they don't like all of this money in being spent in the elections, but they generally don't look at it as a primary issue that members of Congress need to tackle. And members of Congress are struggling to tackle the issues that they do care about, let alone these types of issues. So many people will say this is a wicked problem that's really difficult to solve and you can't just put the blame on any one person. But then others would say, hey, this is an okay thing. This is our constitutional right to do this, whether it's an independent person or a person giving directly to a candidate or a wealthy corporation. So to conclude, if you're interested in this topic and want to learn more, I will be teaching the PLSC 4343, and I know there's one more digit in there because we went to 5 digits. I think it's 43043.
434.
They may know more than me. I don't know what the digits are anymore after we went to 5 digits. It's 43043. Yeah, I think that's what it is, 43043. Clearly I've done in my slides since we went to 5 digits. I will be teaching that class as a January intersession. It's a 2-week course. And we will go in and learn a little more about the history of campaign finance, but again, collect that data, and I'll teach you how to analyze that data and present that data and answer some of these questions that I'm throwing out there. Because I may have my ideas about it, but you may have your ideas. And when we bring those ideas together, we generally come to some kind of better understanding of money and politics. So if you have any questions or comments or would like to share something with me, please let me know. Email me at ksebold@uark.edu. I would love to chat with you. That's all I've got. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you, Dr. Sebold. We have time for a couple of questions, so if you got any, please feel free to ask them now. Just raise your hand.
I'll keep this on then.
You know, nonprofits, 501(c)s are governed by what their board of directors set up in their mission statement for their contributions and what that person goes with. Are there any parameters that squeeze out foreign dignitaries giving or anything?
501(c). Okay, so one thing is foreigners are not allowed.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, that's a good idea. Let me put this back on too. Well, so it's a good idea for me to do that. Question. She was asking about foreign dignitaries or any kind of restrictions on the 501(c)s. Foreigners are not allowed to contribute to the election. That would be the case with 501(c)s too, but going to be harder to monitor. And yes, there are some restrictions on these 501(c)s. They have to largely be related to welfare issues, public welfare issues, social welfare issues. They cannot be largely engaged in political issues or politics, I should say. So they're not supposed to be political groups. They're supposed to be like, nonprofits that are focused on issues that affect the public welfare. And that could be a variety of things, from, like gun rights, NRA, they could form a 501(c) protecting gun rights, to, a group fighting gun rights. So yeah, there are some restrictions, but they're pretty limited. They're also regulated under the IRS, not the FEC. And so you're going to be relying on the IRS, which is right now not doing great, to kind of make sure they're doing what they're supposed to be. Good question on 501(c)s. Perhaps you'd like to know how to open a 501(c). So many of you are involved in groups on campus and in your future professional endeavors. That's something else we'll talk about in my Money and Politics class. Okay, any other questions? I think it's probably because it's 5:25 and you have a lot of cookies.
How do nonprofits afford to hire employees?
How do nonprofits afford to hire employees? This is a good one, because that's what I spend a lot of my time doing, is like directing my students toward finding those jobs at nonprofits. They are able to pay them out of the money that they raise to organize the group and keep it functioning. But I will say those are some of the lower paying jobs. This is what we would call a starter job for our college students. Get in with a 501(c) or other super PAC or nonprofit, and then work your way up the ladder. But there's a lot of experience that can be gained working at a 501(c) or nonprofit. I'm definitely not putting these groups down, and it's all very subjective on what you think is a good group or a bad group. But all of these groups are working for your rights, the issues that you care about. And we all just have differences on what we support or don't support. But yeah, I think these are things that you want to look at as you're a political science major, and I hope so many of you are, because there are lots of things you can do with a political science degree, including working for these groups that I'm talking about. Many of my students go on to work for them. I'd love to talk to you more about that if you're interested. Yeah, they'll be able to pay you, and they will pay you out of the money that they raise for the group. They raise quite a bit of money, some of these groups. Not all groups are the same, but some will do better than others. Any other questions? That was a good one. Okay, well, I really appreciate your interest in this topic. I look forward to meeting some of you personally in class or outside of the classroom to talk more about it. And please help yourself to any cookies and coffee on the way out. And I want to thank the state of Arkansas for funding this, as well as Bill Schreckheis for making it a priority for our department. Thank you.
Let's give Dr. Sebold. Yeah.